The kettle had been screaming for longer than I cared to admit. I stood there in my kitchen, barefoot on the cold linoleum, watching steam pour from its spout like some kind of desperate prayer rising toward the ceiling. The clock on the microwave glowed 11:47. Outside, rain hammered against the windows with a violence that made the whole house seem smaller, more fragile than it had any right to be. I should have turned off the burner. Should have made my tea and gone to bed like any reasonable person would at this hour. But something kept me frozen there, listening to that shrill cry mixing with the storm's percussion, as if the kettle were announcing something I wasn't ready to hear. Then came the knock. 3 measured raps against my front door, barely audible above the weather, but somehow cutting through everything else. I knew immediately it wasn't a neighbor. Neighbors don't visit at midnight during thunderstorms. Neighbors don't knock with that particular weight of desperation. The kettle screamed louder. I turned off the flame and walked through my small living room, past the couch that had seen too many solitary evenings, past the stack of books I kept meaning to read, past the piano I kept meaning to play. Each step felt deliberate, heavy with the kind of certainty that comes just before your life changes direction. I opened the door. Theo stood there, soaked to the bone, water dripping from his dark hair onto my doormat. His chest rose and fell like he'd been running, though his car sat in my driveway with its engine still ticking in the cold. In one hand, he clutched a navy duffel bag, the same one he'd carried to college 15 years ago. His eyes were red-rimmed. Whether from crying or the wind, I couldn't tell. We looked at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. I took in the familiar curve of his jaw, now sharper than I remembered. The way his shoulders had broadened since I'd last seen him. The wedding ring that was no longer there. He said nothing at first, just lifted that duffel bag slightly, like it was an explanation in itself. Like it could speak for whatever had driven him across the city to my door in the middle of a storm that should have kept any sane person home. I stepped aside. He walked past me, bringing the smell of rain and something else I couldn't name. Something that reminded me of being 22 and stupid, and so full of feelings I didn't know what to do with them all. He set the bag down by my couch, careful and quiet, like he was afraid of disturbing something sacred. I told him there were towels in the bathroom. He nodded and disappeared down the hall. I heard the soft click of the door closing, the rustle of wet clothes being peeled away. I stood there in my living room, suddenly aware of how small my life had become, how carefully I'd constructed this space to hold exactly one person's worth of loneliness. When he emerged, wearing an old t-shirt I'd forgotten I owned, his hair dark and damp against his forehead, he looked younger. More like the boy who used to fall asleep on my dorm room floor after late nights spent talking about everything and nothing. I told him he could take the couch. He said thank you. We stood there for another moment, the weight of unasked questions filling the space between us, before I finally retreated to my bedroom. But sleep wouldn't come. I lay there listening to the storm gradually exhaust itself against my windows, listening to Theo shift and turn on my couch, listening to the house settle around this new presence it hadn't felt in so long. And I found myself remembering things I'd spent years trying to forget. The way he used to lean against me when we watched movies, casual and warm like it meant nothing. The night we'd stayed up until dawn talking about our fears, and how his hand had found mine in the darkness of my dorm room. How he'd looked at me sometimes, like he was on the verge of saying something that would change everything between us. How I'd waited for him to say it. How he never did. I'd buried all of that so carefully, built my quiet life around the absence of it. And now here he was, in my living room at midnight with a bag full of whatever pieces his life had broken into. Here he was, and something inside me that I'd thought was dead was stirring awake again. Something that felt dangerously like coming home. Morning came gray and muted, the way it always did in my corner of the city. I woke to the familiar sounds of my neighborhood stirring to life. The distant hum of traffic, Mrs. Chin sweeping her front steps, the garbage truck making its weekly pilgrimage down our narrow street. But underneath it all was something new. The soft sound of someone else breathing in my house. I found Theo in my kitchen, standing at the window with a cup of coffee in his hands. He'd found my French press, figured out where I kept the beans, made himself at home in the careful architecture of my solitude. The sight of him there, backlit by morning light, made my chest tighten with something I couldn't name. He turned when he heard my footsteps. "Good morning," he said, and his voice was softer than I remembered, worn down by whatever had driven him here. I noticed the dark circles under his eyes, the way his shoulders seemed to carry more weight than they used to. I poured myself coffee, and we stood there in comfortable silence, two people who had once known each other's rhythms so well that words weren't always necessary. Through the window, I could see my small backyard with its overgrown garden, the brick wall that separated my property from the alley behind it. Everything looked the same as it had yesterday, but felt fundamentally different. This house had been my sanctuary for the past 5 years. A modest brownstone from the 1920s, nothing remarkable about it except that it was mine. 3 bedrooms, though I only used one. A living room with hardwood floors that creaked in all the right places. A kitchen barely big enough for 2 people, which had never been a problem before. I'd chosen this neighborhood deliberately. Quiet streets lined with similar houses, most of them occupied by people who kept to themselves. Close enough to the university where I worked that I could take the bus, far enough from downtown that I could pretend the rest of the world didn't exist when I needed to. My life had settled into a rhythm over the years, precise and predictable as a metronome. Coffee at 6 in the morning, black with 1 sugar. The 7:15 bus that carried me through neighborhoods I'd learned to read like chapters in a book. The university archive where I spent my days in climate-controlled silence, repairing the broken spines of books that had outlived their original readers. It was work that suited me. Book conservation required patience, steady hands, attention to detail. I could spend hours carefully removing old adhesive from a binding, or painstakingly cleaning centuries-old paper with specialized brushes. Each book was a puzzle, a problem to be solved through research and careful technique. And at the end of each day, something that had been broken was whole again. Lunch was always in the small park across from the archive, usually with whatever paperback I was reading at the time. Ham sandwich, apple, bottle of water. I'd claimed the same bench months ago, under an oak tree that provided shade in summer and let light through in winter. Other people passed by, students, professors, maintenance workers, but we rarely spoke. I preferred it that way. Home by 5:30. Dinner for 1. Television or reading until I felt tired enough to sleep. Weekends were for grocery shopping, laundry, the small maintenance tasks that kept my ordered world functioning smoothly. I told myself for years that I'd chosen this life, that the solitude was intentional, beneficial even, that I was content with my books and my work and my quiet house on its quiet street. But standing there with Theo in my kitchen, I realized how carefully I'd constructed my days to hold exactly one person's worth of existence. The evidence was everywhere once I started looking for it. Framed photographs on my mantelpiece showed faces from another life, college friends who'd gotten married and moved away, coworkers from jobs I'd left behind, family gatherings I attended less and less frequently. My mother's voice lived perpetually in my voicemail box, asking when I'd visit, when I'd call her back, whether I was eating enough vegetables. I'd learned to delete her messages without listening to them completely. In the corner of my living room sat the piano I'd inherited from my grandmother, its bench still piled with sheet music I'd stopped playing years ago. Sometimes late at night, I'd run my fingers along the keys without pressing them, feeling the familiar weight and resistance, but never making any sound. It seemed easier that way, less likely to disturb the careful quiet I'd built around myself. Theo was the opposite of quiet. He always had been, even back in college when we'd shared that cramped dorm room with its thin walls and thinner mattresses. He filled spaces naturally, easily, the way light fills a room when you open the curtains. Loud laughter, animated conversations with strangers, the kind of charisma that drew people to him without effort. He worked in construction management now, something that suited his need to be in motion, to solve problems with his hands and his voice and his relentless optimism. He'd told me about it years ago, how he loved the rhythm of building sites, the satisfaction of watching something rise from nothing more than blueprints and determination. Until last week, he'd been engaged. I'd met her exactly once, at a party I'd attended reluctantly and left early. Sarah, blonde, confident, the kind of woman who knew how to navigate social situations I found exhausting. She'd been kind to me, asked about my work, complimented my shirt. I disliked her immediately and hated myself for it. I hadn't seen Theo in almost a year. Not since their engagement party, held in the backyard of a house I'd never visited before and would never visit again. Too many people, too much wine, too many conversations about wedding plans and honeymoon destinations. I'd found myself in their garden sometime after midnight, sitting on a stone bench and trying to gather the courage to leave without seeming rude. That's where Theo had found me. He'd been drinking too. I could tell by the way he moved, looser and more unguarded than usual. He'd sat down beside me on that bench, and we'd talked about nothing important: work, the weather, a book we'd both read in college. But something had shifted between us that night, some door that had been carefully locked for years creaking slowly open. He'd looked at me in the garden light and said my name like it was a question, like he was asking permission for something neither of us could define. I'd felt my heart beating too fast, felt the words rising in my throat that I'd been swallowing for 15 years. Then Sarah had called from the house, asking where he'd gone, and the moment dissolved like sugar in rain. I'd left that party with my hands shaking and my chest full of something that felt too much like hope. I'd avoided his calls for weeks afterward, let them go to voicemail, told myself I was protecting us both from whatever dangerous thing had almost happened in that garden. And now here he was in my kitchen, holding my coffee cup, no ring on his finger, no Sarah calling from another room. Here he was, and I still didn't know what questions I was allowed to ask. How long he planned to stay. What had finally broken that perfect life he'd been building with someone else. What it meant that when everything fell apart, he'd come to me. 3 days passed before he told me why he'd come. We'd fallen into a strange domestic rhythm by then, tiptoeing around each other in my small kitchen, sharing the morning paper over coffee, pretending this was normal. Pretending that having another person in my carefully calibrated space didn't make me hyper-aware of every sound, every movement, every breath. Theo had always been good at filling silences, but something was different now. He'd go quiet in the middle of sentences, lose track of conversations, stare out windows like he was looking for something that wasn't there. I didn't push. I'd learned long ago that Theo revealed things in his own time, in his own way. That third evening, he came home with Chinese takeout and 2 bottles of beer. He'd been out job hunting, he said, though we both knew he wasn't ready to think about work yet. The takeout was from Golden Dragon, the same place we used to order from in college when we were too broke or too lazy to cook. He remembered that I always ordered the same thing: sweet and sour chicken, extra rice, no vegetables. We spread the containers across my coffee table and ate sitting on the floor, our backs against the couch. It felt like being 20 again, except for the weight of everything we weren't saying. That's when he told me. She cheated with her coworker, he said, picking at his lo mein with a plastic fork. Said I was too emotionally distant. He laughed when he said it, but the sound was hollow, bitter, like he was trying to convince himself it was funny instead of devastating. I didn't laugh. I watched him instead, the way his shoulders tensed even as he tried to appear casual. The way his jaw worked like he was chewing on words he couldn't quite swallow. The way his eyes focused anywhere but on mine. How long? I asked. 6 months, maybe longer. He shrugged like it didn't matter, but his hands were trembling slightly as he reached for his beer. She said she tried to talk to me about it. Said I never really listened. The thing was, I could picture it perfectly. Theo had always been generous with his attention, but only up to a point. He could charm strangers at parties, make anyone feel like the most interesting person in the room, but intimacy made him restless. Real intimacy, the kind that required him to be still long enough to be truly seen. I'd watched him do it in college too. Date girls who adored him, who wanted to dig deeper, get closer, understand what made him tick. And just when they started asking the right questions, he'd find reasons to pull away. Too busy with classes, too focused on his future, too something. Maybe she had a point, I said quietly. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment his careful composure cracked. Maybe she did, he admitted. but that doesn't make it hurt less. We finished eating in silence. The fortune cookies sat untouched between us, holding their small promises and predictions that neither of us seemed ready to face. Later, after we'd cleaned up and settled into the familiar rhythm of evening television, something shifted between us. We were watching some mindless comedy, the laugh track filling the spaces where our own laughter might have been, and I became acutely aware of how close we were sitting. Not touching, but close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. During a commercial break, he asked if he could stay a little longer. "Just until I figure things out," he said. The words hung in the air between us, loaded with implications neither of us was ready to examine. I knew I should ask what that meant. How long was a little longer? What exactly he needed to figure out? Whether this was about finding a new apartment or something deeper, more complicated. Instead, I just nodded. Something in my chest began to unravel then, some carefully maintained wall starting to crumble. I'd spent 5 years building a life that required nothing from anyone, that could function perfectly well in isolation. And here I was, agreeing to let someone else's chaos bleed into my ordered world. We went back to watching television, but I wasn't seeing the screen anymore. I was thinking about the way he'd said my name in that garden a year ago. The way his hand had almost touched mine on that stone bench before Sarah's voice called him back to his other life. The next few days took on a different quality, like we were both settling into something we couldn't quite name. We cooked dinner together, arguing good-naturedly about seasoning and cooking times the way we had in college. He introduced me to music I'd never heard, bands with names that sounded like poetry or prayers. I made him watch the black and white films I loved, the ones where people spoke in careful, measured sentences about important things. We took long walks through my neighborhood, past houses where other people lived their coupled lives behind lit windows. He told me stories about construction sites and difficult clients. I told him about the books I was restoring, the satisfaction of bringing something broken back to wholeness. But underneath our easy conversation, something else was growing. A stillness that felt pregnant with all the things we'd never said to each other, all the questions we'd never asked, all the truths we'd spent 15 years carefully avoiding. I caught him watching me sometimes when he thought I wasn't looking. Not the casual way friends observe each other, but with an intensity that made my skin feel too warm, too tight. And I wondered if he could feel it too, this pull between us that had always been there, but never acknowledged. One evening, while he was in the shower, I found myself in my bedroom closet, looking for a sweater I hadn't worn in months. Instead, I found a box I'd forgotten I'd kept. College memorabilia, mostly. Old textbooks, photographs, ticket stubs from concerts and movies. And at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper like something precious, a notebook I hadn't opened in 15 years. I sat on my bedroom floor and unwrapped it slowly, my hands shaking slightly. The cover was worn, the spiral binding loose from age and handling. Inside were pages and pages of my handwriting, younger and more hopeful than I remembered being. Letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Theo, all written during those long nights in our dorm room when he was asleep and I was lying awake with my chest full of words I didn't know how to say out loud. I read them in the half-light filtering through my bedroom window, each one a small confession I'd been too afraid to make. Letters about the way he looked when he laughed, about how his presence made even ordinary moments feel significant, about the terrible, wonderful realization that I was in love with my best friend and had no idea what to do about it. I'd written them like prayers, like wishes, like messages in bottles I was too cowardly to cast into the sea. And then I'd hidden them away, convinced that keeping them secret was the same as keeping them safe. The water stopped running in my bathroom. I heard Theo moving around, getting dressed, humming something under his breath. I should have closed the notebook, put it back in its box, pretended I'd never found it. Instead, I kept reading. Outside my bedroom door, footsteps paused. I could feel him there, just on the other side of the thin wood that separated us. Could imagine him raising his hand to knock, then thinking better of it. Could picture him standing there in my hallway, listening to the whisper of pages turning, the soft catch of my breath as I read words I'd written to him so long ago. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. But something passed between us in that silence, some acknowledgement of all the things that had been waiting patiently in the space between what we were and what we might have been. The footsteps moved away eventually. I heard him settling onto the couch, heard the soft murmur of late-night television. But I stayed where I was, sitting on my bedroom floor with 15 years of unspoken love spread out around me like evidence of a crime I'd never had the courage to commit. We never spoke about that night, about the letters, or the listening, or the weight of silence that had passed between us through my bedroom door. But something had shifted, some invisible line crossed that neither of us could uncross. The days that followed took on the quality of a half-remembered dream. We moved through my house like ghosts of our younger selves, falling back into rhythms that felt both foreign and familiar. Theo remembered that I liked my coffee strong enough to wake the dead. I remembered that he hummed unconsciously when he was content, always the same few bars of songs I could never identify. We developed new rituals without discussing them, shared breakfasts over the morning paper, and reading me headlines while I sorted through the book review section. Long walks through neighborhoods I'd lived near for years but never really explored. Theo pointing out architectural details with the practiced eye of someone who understood how things were built. He had opinions about everything: which houses had good bones, which gardens showed real care, which corner stores sold the best coffee. His enthusiasm was infectious in a way that made me remember why I'd been drawn to him in college, before I'd learned to be afraid of that pull. We fell back into old inside jokes, references to professors we'd both hated and movies we'd watched too many times in our cramped dorm room. But there was something different about it now, something more deliberate. Like we were both trying to prove that we could still be those people, that 15 years of separate lives hadn't changed the fundamental way we fit together. Except it had changed us. I could see it in the careful way Theo watched me sometimes, like he was trying to reconcile the person I'd become with the one he remembered. I felt it in my own hyper-awareness of every gesture, every word, every moment when we stood too close or let a silence stretch too long. The tension was always there, simmering just beneath the surface of our comfortable domesticity. It lived in the space between us when we cooked dinner together, in the way our eyes would meet and then dart away, in the careful choreography we performed around each other in my small kitchen. One Saturday morning, I decided to finally hang the floating shelves I'd bought months ago and never gotten around to installing. Theo offered to help, said he had more experience with power tools than I did. I handed him the drill and watched him work, the careful precision of his movements, the way he checked and double-checked his measurements. We were mounting the second shelf when it happened. I was holding it level while he marked the wall, our bodies pressed close in the narrow space of my living room. His hand came up to steady the shelf at the same moment mine did, and our fingers brushed against each other. Neither of us moved. The moment stretched out like taffy, sweet and impossible to break. I could feel the warmth of his skin against mine, could hear his breathing change, could sense something electric crackling in the air between us. His fingers were calloused from years of construction work, rough against my softer ones. I should have pulled away. Should have made some joke about too many hands making light work. Should have created distance before the moment could mean anything we weren't ready for it to mean. Instead, I let my fingers stay where they were, let them trace the edge of his thumb in a gesture so small it might have been accidental. Except we both knew it wasn't. The spell broke when the shelf slipped, nearly falling before Theo caught it with his other hand. We finished the job in careful silence, him holding hardware while I marked measurements, both of us maintaining just enough distance to be safe. That evening, we sat in my living room with the lights turned low, the new shelves casting interesting shadows on the wall. Theo was quiet, more subdued than usual, staring at his hands like they held answers to questions he hadn't figured out how to ask. "I feel more at peace here than I ever did with her," he said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. I was reading, or pretending to read, and I didn't look up from my book. "Maybe peace isn't what scares you," I replied. He was quiet for so long I thought he might not respond. "Then, what do you think scares me?" I finally looked at him then, really looked at him. The same face I'd memorized in college, but older now, more weathered. lines around his eyes that spoke of years I hadn't been part of, experiences I'd only heard about secondhand. The same thing that scares me, I said. The possibility that this isn't temporary. Something changed between us after that conversation. We began to share more, digging deeper than surface pleasantries and shared memories. He told me about the nights he'd lie awake next to Sarah, feeling like a stranger in his own life. About the way he'd started picking fights just to feel something, anything, other than the hollow contentment that had settled over his days like dust. I told him about the careful architecture of my solitude, how I'd built my life to require nothing from anyone and called it independence instead of fear. About the books I restored at work, how sometimes I wondered if I was trying to fix myself through them. We talked about regrets, about roads not taken, about the weight of choices that had seemed small at the time but had shaped everything that came after. He asked me if I'd ever been in love, really in love, and I told him the truth without telling him the whole truth. Once I said, a long time ago. He didn't ask for details, and I didn't offer any. But with each conversation, each small revelation, I found myself daring to hope. Not for anything specific, not for grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but for the simple possibility that maybe we were both finally ready to stop running from whatever this was between us. Hope, I discovered, was a dangerous thing. It made me pay attention to small details that might mean nothing. The way Theo looked at me over morning coffee. The fact that he'd unpacked his duffel bag completely, clothes now hanging in my guest room closet like he planned to stay. The way he touched my shoulder when he passed behind my chair. Casual contact that felt anything but casual. But hope also made me prepare for disappointment. I caught myself folding laundry like it was a ritual, each shirt and pair of pants a small prayer that he wouldn't leave. I counted days without meaning to, marking time like someone waiting for a sentence to be pronounced. 3 weeks. That's how long he'd been there when everything changed again. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of screaming. Not loud screaming, not the kind that would wake the neighbors, but desperate and broken and absolutely terrifying. It was coming from my living room, from the couch where Theo slept. I was on my feet and moving before I was fully awake, muscle memory from years of being the responsible one, the one who fixed things when they broke. I found him thrashing against my couch cushions, caught in the grip of some nightmare that had its claws deep in him. His face was twisted with anguish, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. He was saying something, words I couldn't make out, his voice thick with sleep and terror. I knelt beside the couch and touched his shoulder gently. Theo, I said, wake up. You're dreaming. His eyes snapped open, wild and unfocused, and for a moment he didn't seem to recognize me. Then awareness flooded back, and he sat up abruptly, running his hands through his hair, trying to orient himself in my darkened living room. Sorry, he said, his voice rough with sleep. Sorry, I didn't mean to wake you. But he was shaking, trembling like a man coming in from the cold, and something in his expression reminded me of the boy I'd known in college, the one who'd sometimes wake from bad dreams but never talk about what he'd seen. I sat down on the edge of the couch without asking permission, close enough to offer comfort, but far enough away to give him space if he needed it. He looked at me for a long moment, something vulnerable and raw flickering across his features. Then he reached for me. Not tentatively, not carefully, but with the desperate urgency of someone drowning. His arms came around me and pulled me against him, and suddenly I was holding him while he buried his face against my shoulder, his whole body shaking with whatever ghosts had followed him out of sleep. I should have said something comforting, should have asked about the dream or offered to make tea or done any of the practical things that people do when someone they care about is hurting. Instead, I just held him, one hand moving slowly up and down his back, feeling the rapid beat of his heart against my chest. He clung to me like I was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become liquid, uncertain. His breath was warm against my neck, his grip tight enough to leave marks I'd find tomorrow. The embrace went on longer than comfort required, longer than friendship allowed, longer than either of us could pretend meant nothing. But neither of us pulled away. In the darkness of my living room, With the weight of his body against mine and the sound of his breathing gradually slowing back to normal, I felt something inside me finally surrender. Some last wall I'd been maintaining crumbled completely, leaving me defenseless against the truth I'd been running from for 15 years. I was still in love with him, had never stopped being in love with him. And maybe, just maybe, he was finally ready to stop running too. The storm arrived 3 days later, rolling in from the west with the kind of intensity that made the evening news. I watched it approach from my kitchen window while I washed dishes from dinner, dark clouds building like bruises against the pale sky. Theo was somewhere behind me, puttering around my living room, straightening books that didn't need straightening. We'd been careful with each other since the night of his nightmare, maintaining just enough distance to pretend that embrace hadn't changed everything between us. But the pretending was getting harder, more exhausting than either of us wanted to admit. The first drops hit my window just as I was drying the last plate. Then the sky opened up completely, rain hammering against the glass with a violence that made my small kitchen feel even smaller. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely. We stood in sudden darkness, the only sound the storm's relentless percussion against my house. Then I heard Theo moving around in the living room, opening drawers, searching for something. Found them, he called out, and moments later candlelight began to bloom from the other room. I stayed where I was, still holding the dish towel, listening to his footsteps approaching. He appeared in my kitchen doorway carrying one of the votive candles I kept for emergencies, its small flame casting dancing shadows across his face. He set the candle on my counter, and we stood there looking at each other in the flickering light. The storm outside seemed to press against my windows, making the house feel like a ship riding out rough weather. Everything felt heightened, more significant, like the universe had conspired to create this moment of perfect isolation. That's when he said it. I read them. The words hung in the air between us, simple and devastating. I felt my blood turn to ice water, felt my grip tighten on the dish towel until my knuckles went white. What? I managed to say, though I already knew. Already understood what those 3 words meant and why he was looking at me with that expression I couldn't quite read. The letters, he said, his voice gentle but unwavering. From school. I found them weeks ago. The world tilted sideways. I felt like I was falling even though my feet were still firmly planted on my kitchen floor. The notebook. That night when he'd stood outside my bedroom door, listening to me turn pages in the half-light. He hadn't just been listening. He'd been waiting. I tried to speak, tried to find words that could explain or excuse or somehow undo what couldn't be undone. But my throat felt like someone had filled it with sand. All I could do was stand there, exposed and terrified, while 15 years of carefully guarded secrets crumbled around me. He took a step closer, close enough that I could see the candle flame reflected in his eyes. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he asked. It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't angry. It was the kind of question that comes from someone who genuinely wants to understand, someone who's been carrying their own weight of wondering and finally has the courage to ask for answers. "Because I knew you'd never stay," I whispered. The words came out so quietly I wasn't sure he'd heard them over the storm. But I saw something shift in his expression, some door opening that had been locked for longer than either of us could measure. He was close enough now that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could count the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. Close enough that when he lifted his hand to touch my face, I could see it trembling slightly. "Silas," he said, and my name sounded different in his mouth than it ever had before. Like a prayer, like an apology, like the answer to a question I'd been afraid to ask. Then he kissed me. It was nothing like the kisses I'd imagined in all those letters I'd written and never sent. Nothing like the desperate, passionate reunion scenes I'd played out in my head during the lonely years after college. It was hesitant, uncertain, so gentle it felt like he was afraid I might disappear if he pressed too hard. His lips were soft and warm and tasted like the coffee we'd shared after dinner. His hand cupped my face like I was something precious, something that might break if handled carelessly. And for a moment that felt like forever, 15 years of careful distance collapsed into nothing. Then he pulled away. The absence of his touch was immediate and devastating. I watched him take a step backward, then another, saw something like panic flash across his features. The candlelight flickered between us, casting shadows that made everything feel unreal, like a scene from someone else's life. I should have said something. Should have told him it was okay, that we could take this slow, that we didn't have to figure everything out right now. Should have reached for him before he could retreat completely back into the safety of uncertainty. Instead, I just stood there, frozen by the magnitude of what had just happened. He turned and left the kitchen without another word. I heard his footsteps crossing my living room, heard the soft click of the guest room door closing. Then there was nothing but the storm and the candle flame and the sound of my own heart beating so loud I was sure it would wake the neighbors. I sank down onto one of my kitchen chairs, still clutching that dish towel like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to earth. Every wall I'd built inside myself over the past 15 years was collapsing at once, leaving me defenseless against the full weight of everything I'd been holding back. The truth was finally out there between us, impossible to take back or pretend away. He'd read those letters, every word of longing and hope and desperate love I'd poured onto paper in the safety of darkness. He knew exactly how I felt about him, had known for weeks while I'd been tiptoeing around my own feelings like they were landmines. And he'd kissed me, brief and uncertain and tender, yes, but real. As real as the storm battering my windows, as real as the candle burning down to nothing on my counter, as real as the ache in my chest that felt like my heart was trying to beat its way out of my body. But then he'd run, just like I'd always known he would, just like I'd told him he would in that whisper that had been both confession and accusation. I sat there in my darkened kitchen, listening to the storm gradually exhaust itself against my house, and tried to figure out what came next. How do you continue living in the same space with someone after a moment like that? How do you go back to careful conversations and shared meals and pretending that everything is the same as it was before? The candle burned lower, wax pooling on my counter. Soon it would go out completely, leaving me alone in the darkness with nothing but the memory of his lips against mine and the terrible, wonderful knowledge that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the only one who'd been carrying this secret all these years. Maybe he'd been running from the same thing I had. Maybe that's why it had taken him so long to kiss me, and why he'd pulled away so quickly afterward. Maybe the real question wasn't whether he felt the same way I did, but whether either of us was brave enough to stop running long enough to find out. The next day was quiet. Too quiet. I woke to sunlight streaming through my bedroom windows and the sound of running water from the kitchen. For a moment, I let myself pretend that nothing had changed, that yesterday's kiss had been just another dream I'd confused with reality. But then I touched my lips and could still feel the ghost of his mouth against mine, still taste the lingering sweetness of something I'd waited 15 years to experience. When I finally made it to the kitchen, Theo was already dressed and putting on his jacket. He'd made coffee but hadn't waited for me, hadn't left a cup ready like he had every morning for the past month. His movements were quick, efficient, like someone late for an important appointment. Going out for a while, he said without looking at me. Need to run some errands. The words were casual enough, but something in his tone told me he was lying. Or at least not telling the whole truth. These weren't errands he needed to run. They were escape routes he needed to explore. I poured myself coffee and nodded like I believed him. Like I couldn't see the tension in his shoulders, the way he was avoiding eye contact, the careful distance he was maintaining between us and my small kitchen. He left without saying when he'd be back. I spent the day trying to focus on anything other than the memory of last night. I organized my bookshelf, cleaned bathrooms that didn't need cleaning, sorted through old magazines I'd been meaning to throw away. But every task felt hollow, performed by someone going through the motions of normal life, while their actual existence hung in suspension. By afternoon, I'd run out of distractions. I found myself sitting at my kitchen table with a book I wasn't reading, listening for the sound of his key in my front door. The house felt too big and too small at the same time, every room echoing with his absence. He didn't come back until evening, long after the sun had set, and I'd given up pretending to be productively occupied. I heard his car pull into my driveway, heard his footsteps on my front porch, heard the careful way he opened the door like he was trying not to wake someone. I was in my living room, staring at the television without seeing whatever was playing on the screen. He came in carrying plastic bags from the hardware store, tools he probably didn't need for projects that probably didn't exist. "Hey," he said, the word floating between us like a question neither of us knew how to answer. "Hey," I replied. He sat down in the chair across from me, farther away than he'd sat in weeks. The distance felt intentional, calculated, like he'd measured out exactly how much space he needed to feel safe. We watched television in careful silence, both of us pretending to be absorbed in a sitcom that wasn't particularly funny. During commercial breaks, I could feel him looking at me, then looking away quickly when I turned toward him. The weight of everything unsaid pressed down on us like a physical thing. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I turned off the television and faced him directly. "What does this mean to you?" I asked. The question hung in the air between us, stark and unavoidable. He looked everywhere except at my face, at his hands, at the wall behind me, at the floor where we'd embraced just days ago. The silence stretched out so long I began to think he wouldn't answer at all. Then, quietly, "I don't know how to be this." This, like what had happened between us, was a foreign language he'd never learned to speak, a country he'd never learned to navigate. "Then don't be anything," I said. "Just be here." Something in his expression cracked then, some carefully maintained composure finally giving way. He leaned forward in his chair, elbows on his knees, and I saw him the way I'd seen him that night after his nightmare, vulnerable and raw and desperately trying to hold himself together. "I've always known something was different," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Even back in college, even with Sarah, I kept thinking if I just tried harder, if I just committed more fully to the life I was supposed to want, the feeling would go away." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "More performance than truth," he continued. "That's what my whole life has been, playing the part of someone who wanted things I never actually wanted." I wanted to reach for him then, to close the distance between us and offer comfort the way I had that night on the couch. But something in his posture told me he needed space to finish saying what he'd come back here to say. The engagement, the house, the plans we made, it all felt like wearing clothes that didn't fit. Like I was trying to squeeze myself into someone else's life and calling it happiness because I didn't know what else to call it. He finally looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw 15 years of confusion and fear and desperate hope all tangled together in his eyes. "But here, with you, this feels real. It feels like me. And that terrifies me because I don't know what comes next. I don't know how to want this without destroying it." The honesty in his voice was devastating. I could see how much it cost him to say these things, to admit that everything he'd built his adult life around had been a carefully constructed lie he'd told himself and everyone else. "Then start with honesty," I said. "That's all we need right now." We sat there looking at each other across the space of my living room. Two people who'd spent 15 years dancing around the same truth finally ready to stop running from it. There was no kiss this time, no grand gesture or dramatic declaration. Just the quiet recognition that we'd both been carrying the same secret and were finally brave enough to set it down. Theo stood up slowly, like someone testing whether their legs would support them. He crossed the room and sat down beside me on the couch, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body, far enough away that neither of us had to make any decisions about what came next. Then, without looking at me, he reached for my hand. His fingers intertwined with mine, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. His palm was warm and slightly damp, his grip just tight enough to let me know he wasn't planning to let go anytime soon. We sat like that in the soft lamplight of my living room, holding hands like teenagers who'd just discovered they liked each other. It should have felt anticlimactic after 15 years of build-up, after all the drama and uncertainty and careful avoidance. Instead, it felt like coming home. Not the dramatic, sweeping kind of homecoming you see in movies, but the quiet kind that happens when you finally stop fighting against the current and let yourself be carried to where you were always supposed to end up. Outside, my neighborhood settled into its evening rhythm. Cars pulling into driveways, porch lights switching on, families gathering around dinner tables behind lit windows. All the ordinary rituals of ordinary lives continuing their ordinary course. But inside my living room, something extraordinary was finally beginning. Something that had been waiting patiently for 15 years for both of us to be ready to stop running from it. Something that felt, for the first time and longer than I could remember, like the truth. Weeks passed. Time moved differently after that night, measured not in days or hours, but in small moments of domestic grace. Theo never left. Not permanently, not temporarily, not even for the afternoon apartment hunting trips I kept expecting him to take. Instead, he began the quiet work of rebuilding himself from the ground up. He found a therapist, a soft-spoken woman with an office downtown who specialized in what he carefully called life transitions. He went every Tuesday at 2, returning home with the slightly shell-shocked expression of someone who'd spent an hour examining parts of himself he'd kept carefully locked away. He changed his phone number, disconnected from old friends who knew him only as half of someone else's couple, from coworkers who still asked about wedding plans, from a life that no longer fit the shape of who he was becoming. He quit drinking. Not dramatically, not with announcements or ceremonies, just quietly stopped reaching for beer with dinner, stopped suggesting we open wine while we cooked. I found the bottles I kept for guests moved to the back of my kitchen cabinet, out of sight but not thrown away, like he understood the difference between avoiding temptation and pretending it didn't exist. He didn't label what we were becoming, didn't ask where this was heading or what it meant for the future, didn't make promises about forever or declarations about love that might feel too heavy to carry. But every morning, he made my coffee, strong and black with 1 sugar, exactly the way I'd been making it for myself for years. He'd learned the rhythm of my mornings, the precise moment when I'd emerge from my bedroom, still half asleep and reaching for the comfort of routine. The coffee was always ready, always perfect, a small daily gift that said more than any grand gesture could have. We developed new patterns, quiet rituals that felt both intentional and inevitable. Shared breakfasts over newspapers we read aloud to each other. Evening walks through neighborhoods that were slowly becoming ours instead of just mine. Comfortable silences that no longer felt heavy with unspoken things. He helped me restore a 19th-century poetry collection at work, spending his lunch hours learning about pH-neutral adhesives and proper paper handling techniques. I taught him to play chess on the set I'd inherited from my grandfather, watching him approach each game with the same methodical patience he brought to construction projects. We were careful with each other in ways that felt protective rather than fearful. Careful not to rush, not to assume, not to take for granted this fragile new thing we were building together. But there were signs, small intimacies that crept in like sunrise, too gradual to mark the moment they began, but impossible to ignore once they were there. His hand finding mine during movies. My coffee cup appearing next to his in the sink each morning. The way he'd unconsciously move closer when we sat together on the couch, until I could feel the warmth of his thigh against mine. One night, several weeks after our conversation about honesty, I noticed something that stopped me cold. I was coming back from the bathroom when I saw it, his duffel bag, still sitting by my front door exactly where he'd set it that first stormy night. Still packed, still ready for a quick departure, still holding all his clothes and possessions like he might need to leave at a moment's notice. I stood there staring at it for a long time, this physical reminder that some part of him was still prepared to run, that despite everything, the therapy, the coffee, the quiet intimacy we'd been building, he hadn't fully committed to staying. I picked up the bag and carried it to where he was sitting in my living room, reading a book I'd recommended. He looked up when I set it down beside his chair, understanding immediately what I was asking without words. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he reached for the zipper. He unpacked methodically, the same way he approached everything else. Folded shirts and jeans, socks and underwear, the worn flannel pajamas I remembered from college. He carried everything to the guest room. His room now, I realized, and I followed, watching as he opened drawers I'd cleared for him weeks ago without discussing it. Each piece of clothing was folded carefully, placed in its designated space like he was performing some kind of ceremony. making himself at home in a way that felt both monumental and completely ordinary. We didn't speak during the entire process. Didn't need to. The significance of the moment was clear to both of us. This was him choosing to stay, not just for tonight or next week, but for as long as this thing between us continued to feel worth protecting. When he was finished, he looked around the room that had become his, taking in the small changes he'd made over the past weeks. His books on the nightstand, his jacket hanging in the closet, his reading glasses on the dresser. Evidence of a life taking root. Later that evening, I went to brush my teeth and found something that made me smile for the first time in days. 2 toothbrushes in the same cup. Mine, worn and familiar, and his, newer but already settling into its place beside mine. Such a small thing, but it felt like a promise. Like proof that we were learning to share space, not just physically, but in all the small, unglamorous ways that real intimacy requires. The final scene happened without fanfare, the way most meaningful moments do. I found him asleep on our couch. When had I started thinking of it as ours? One arm thrown over his eyes to block out the lamp I'd left burning. He looked younger in sleep, more like the boy I'd fallen in love with in a dorm room that felt like a lifetime ago. I sat down beside him carefully, not wanting to wake him, but needing to be close. On the coffee table beside me was a piece of paper I'd been carrying around for days, unable to decide what to do with it. Another letter. Not one of the old ones from college, but new. Written in the quiet hours after he'd fallen asleep, when I finally had words for what was happening between us. It wasn't dated. Didn't need to be. Some truths exist outside of time. I think I loved you long before I knew what that meant, it began. The rest of the letter was there on the page, everything I'd been afraid to say out loud, but could finally put into words. About the years of careful distance and the relief of letting it go. About the difference between the love I'd felt at 21 and the love I felt now. Deeper and more patient and infinitely more real. About how he made coffee that tasted like home. I folded the letter and slipped it into my pocket. Maybe I'd give it to him someday, when we were ready for that level of truth spoken aloud. Maybe I'd keep it as a reminder of this moment, this quiet evening when everything finally felt settled into place. The candle on my mantelpiece burned low, casting dancing shadows across his sleeping face. Outside, my neighborhood settled into its nighttime rhythm, the familiar sounds of a world continuing its ordinary course. But here, in my living room, with his steady breathing beside me and the weight of his unspoken presence filling every corner of my carefully ordered life, everything felt extraordinarily, perfectly right. This was what remained after all the running and hiding and fear. Just 2 people who'd found their way back to each other and were finally brave enough to stay.